Hey everyone, this is Laura, producer and editor of Roadmap to Joy, here with a content notice for this episode. In this episode, we talk about grief, which includes discussions of sensitive subject matter, including suicide and infant loss. We believe it's crucial to talk about these subjects with empathy and compassion, but we also want you to prioritize your emotional well-being. If you feel that these subjects may be triggering or cause discomfort, please prioritize your mental and emotional health. If you decide to listen, we'll provide resources in the show notes for anyone who may need support. Please take care of yourself and reach out to trusted individuals or professional services if you require assistance. We appreciate your understanding, and as always, thanks for listening to Roadmap to Joy.
Welcome to Roadmap to Joy. My name is Michaela Gilbreth. I'm an LMSW here at Embark. We're here to talk about grief, and my co-host with me is Jamie Maurer.
Hi, I'm Jamie Maurer. I'm an admissions counselor here at Embark Behavioral Health. I was also a behavioral health technician for years. I'm also on the board of directors for a nonprofit called I Will Love You Forever. We build boxes for moms who lose babies in the hospital. And I actually received a box when I lost my son 10 years ago. So, here to talk about grief.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to talk about kind of our own losses because we are professionals in the mental health field. But to recognize that this is a very personal experience, a very personal sort of passion for us and for the people probably listening here. In addition to being an LMSW, I also am in the middle of my grief certification. I interned and volunteered at the New Song Center for Grieving Children, and I had my own traumatic loss experience. My mom completed suicide 5 years ago. So again, I really appreciate you being here and being vulnerable, being open.
Absolutely. I think it's imperative and incredibly important that we hold space for people who are grieving and that, we're in this together. We got this devastating degree we never asked for.
Absolutely. It's the worst club to be in.
It is.
And we're in it.
Yeah, and we don't want anyone else to join.
But they do.
They do.
So we gotta put out some information on kind of what do we do with this? What is it, right?
Absolutely.
So how would you define grief? What does grief mean to you?
I think to me, honestly, grief is, I guess the best way I heard it described was when I read a book by C.S. Lewis, and he said that, why does grief feel so much like fear? And I think for me, grief is a loss, right? And where there is great grief, where there is great pain, there was great love. And so I think in my years of experience with grief, it really has felt like love with nowhere to go.
There's a great Marvel show where a line says something like, what is grief but love persevering? And that feels so, it resonates so strongly, right?
Absolutely.
I wanted to talk a little bit about some, how do I word this here? Some sort of common ways that we grieve, right? So we have maturational losses, where we go through one stage of life, or our children go through stages of life. And as they develop, or as we develop, we gain something and lose something else, right? So we know that we can have grief for things like our kiddo going to school for the first time, right? We might grieve that sense of, I had a baby and now I have a child, a kiddo, right? And those are normal sort of, we can grieve those things and it's kind of a normal developmental process, right? Yeah. But what we're talking about here, it's grief, right? It's the loss of a person. Can you tell me anything about complicated grief or traumatic grief?
So I think for me, what I've learned about complicated or traumatic grief, it's very layered. Okay, so it's, there are, I don't know, so my sponsor said once, okay, you can't compare your pain with someone else's. This isn't the trauma Olympics.
Gosh.
Yeah, no one's getting a medal here.
Or everyone's getting a medal, and
that
doesn't mean anything either, right?
Exactly. And so, I think in terms of this is, harder or this is more difficult. For me, I had, a 9-week miscarriage. And then a year later, I had a 20-week stillborn baby named Edwin. And, people have said kind of things like, oh, well, wasn't losing Edwin harder? That must have been, I can imagine, going through that. That must have been harder. And for me, it was like, it wasn't harder. It was just different. And I think, that difference from, having a miscarriage and then having, giving birth to a stillborn baby was the visceral trauma of the experience of 36 hours of labor and having this baby that never opened his eyes. That was like a physical, visceral, traumatic kind of thing. And so I think, with traumatic grief, there is an element of like it's complicated. It's not that like, my grandma lived 90 years, the natural life process cycle kind of played out, which doesn't mean that losing your 90-year-old grandma is any easier or harder. It's just different.
Yes.
And so I think for me with losing Edwin, it was, there was PTSD involved. And that took a lot of years and a lot of trauma therapy, EMDR, and all the things to really work through, because it was almost like I couldn't even start grieving until I had worked through the trauma of the loss, And like, so what do you feel like for you that has kind of looked like with traumatic and complicated grief?
Yeah. So just like you, I've been in the behavioral health field, the mental health field, and I've experienced this. So it's kind of this two sides of the same coin, right? So when we think about PTSD, it's post-traumatic stress disorder, we commonly associate that with like veterans, right? So the idea of we're having nightmares, or we think the world is incredibly unsafe, we stop eating and sleeping, we're hypervigilant. All of those things are happening in traumatic grief, and we have lost someone, right? So it's incredibly difficult to untangle. With my own mom, and I think when we talk about traumatic grief, we have to think about kind of that criteria, right? So anytime a parent loses their child, it's traumatic. I mean, that's just the nature of it, right? Anytime there's an unexpected violent death or loss is traumatic. Suicide is always traumatic. I mean, those things are the things that can make us feel unsafe. And on top of that, we've lost someone. So for me, I think you were exactly right. It is layered, right? Because you have those nightmares and those, how did this happen, and all of these things. And while we can recognize that our 90-year-old grandmother who passed peacefully in her sleep surrounded by loved ones, we can still grieve that. There's definitely a deeper component or a more complex component when it's traumatic like that, right? Yeah. I'm wondering if as you were kind of going through your process, you had any like anticipatory grief of like what could happen. I'm grieving this before I even get into it. Do you think that happens for people who go through loss?
Absolutely. I mean, in my own experience, I remember, for 20 weeks that I was pregnant with Edwin, like we knew he was sick at 8 weeks. So my first appointment, they were like, you've got this super rare blood thing where your immune system is going to attack his red blood cells and hopefully he makes it. But I mean, that fear of knowing every day that like I could lose this baby, and that was absolutely something that I went through, and that even, and I worked with hospice patients for a little while too, and even like knowing that it's happening or knowing like it's coming, like nothing prepares you for.
You can know up here and not know here.
18 inches is a long way.
Super long way. Truly.
Yeah. And so, I think that is a whole other, concept, and that's a whole other thing to untangle. And, I think, and when you say like anticipatory grief, that's not the same thing as like grieving something that could have been, or
it's sort of when we think of anticipatory grief, the way that I always kind of think about it is someone who is, let's say, a caregiver, right. And they know that the person they're caring for is terminal, or they know something is wrong, and we are starting to grieve before it happens, but we know it's going to, right?
yeah, that just you saying that just really kind of hits my heart, because I think, a lot of times, and speaking to families whose kids are struggling with suicidal ideations and suicide attempts, and their mental health is really in jeopardy. I can just imagine them feeling that, that it's like you're almost grieving someone or something that's could happen, and so that layer of, like, my child, like, I never dreamed this kind of life that my kid would be living. Like, I guarantee when parents have a kiddo and they're a baby, the last thing that they're thinking is going to happen is that their child's going to be struggling with mental health and with suicidal ideations and suicide attempts. And so, like, kind of grieving that dream that they had for their kid, and like really going through the process of, this is where my kid's at now. So
that's so enlightening and so insightful. I think I want to talk a little bit then about kind of that idea of grieving things that aren't humans, right? We've talked about maturational losses and grief. When we retire, we lose that sense of productivity, for example, which is a normal process. But when we have losses that are intense losses, but they're not people, they're possibilities, they're opportunities, right? Does that feel similar to grief and loss in other ways, do you think?
I mean, in my own experience and, like, pulling from what I've been through, when before losing Edwin, I had a beautiful marriage and a life and, like, a farmhouse with, like, a literal white picket fence, right?
The American dream.
Yes.
Yes.
Like, we actually had a white picket fence. And after losing Edwin, that all really fell apart. And my husband ended up leaving, and I think that dream that, like, I had for what felt like a split second was no longer, and 10 years later, single as a Pringle, but, like, learning to love that life too. I mean, that's, like, grieving what could have been, or what I used to say should have been. I'm learning to rephrase that, because I am where I'm supposed to be now, but I am definitely not where I thought I'd be at 36 years old.
Absolutely.
And so, kind of grieving that dream of, having that family and the kids and all of those things is a total real thing.
And it's normal, right?
Yes, totally normal. Like, if you're at a place in your life that you're like, wow, okay, this is not anything like I thought my life would look like at this age or at this time. I mean, that is completely normal to have a grief experience with what could have been, or those dreams that you thought you would have. I mean, yeah. And even with Edwin too, it was like, and I talk to moms all the time who lose babies, and it's like, a lot of us have been told things like, at least you didn't know them, or at least they weren't older.
The at least are just most unhelpful.
Yes. So I wrote a whole blog that, like, there is no at least in grief. Okay. But you're not just losing a baby, you're losing a toddler, you're losing a high schooler, you're losing, a college graduate, you're losing seeing them get married. I mean, you're losing all of those things that could have been. And that is a whole other layer of grief.
It is.
Yeah.
I want to spend a little time talking about the process of grief, right? I'm going to get on my soapbox for a minute.
Please. I'll build you one.
Thank you. I don't even need you to build me one. I can just get right up there.
Yes.
The sort of grief theory that a lot of Americans know, or that is kind of the general theory, is Dr. Kubler-Ross's model of the 5 stages, right? And that's the one that we know, right?
Yep. 5 stages.
5 stages. So those stages start with denial, end with acceptance. what a lot of people don't recognize or don't realize is that Dr. Kubler-Ross, an excellent doctor, studied death, dying, grieving, open doors, like immense amount of work that she did to get grief to be a serious place of research, right? And to study it and to learn how to deal with it. So this is not out of disrespect.
Yes.
But we took this idea of grief that we have denial and anger and bargaining and sadness and acceptance, and we go through these stages, and then we're just done and we're fine, right?
Yeah, always.
That's the way it works, right? But who she studied was people who had gotten terminal cancer diagnoses, and it was their grieving the loss of their own life, or that process of accepting their eventual death, right? But we took this idea and we sort of just ran with it, right? Part of that is because of it helps us to feel like there's some sense of control. Like, oh, well, if I'm sad, that means I won't get angry anymore, right?
Yeah.
Is that your experience with grief? Does that fit into that mold?
Absolutely. So that was kind of, what I had always heard, right?
Yes.
And like that's what you hear growing up, or people are like, oh, well, you'll go through the stages, right? And then you'll be fine.
Right.
And then like when I wasn't fine, I was like, what is wrong with me?
And
right?
that is the biggest issue, is that if you don't fit in this mold,
Yep.
that isn't meant for grieving people who have survived a loss.
No.
And it doesn't necessarily fit with cancer diagnoses, right? We see those feelings that come up, but there's no stages.
No, there's like squirrels running around little tracks, of like coming back to this and coming back to that. And like, it's just, it is. And I think too, I've heard so many people say really dumb things, which is fine, because people see someone that they love in pain. Yes. And like, as a human, you want to have like an antidote, right? You want to have something to alleviate the pain you see this loved one going through.
And you want some certainty, right?
Yes. And I think too, like grief it is not meant to be understood. It is not meant to be put in a box and formulated and controlled. But I think as humans, we want to have a sense of control over it because that makes us feel safe. Yes. And so like other people's grief makes us uncomfortable. Absolutely. And so when someone else's grief makes you uncomfortable, it's like you as a human being, and this is just our nature, we want to put a formula or like steps or a construct around it. So
let me fix this for you.
Yes. So we have a sense of control.
There's no fixing grief, though.
Grief does not mean we are broken. It means we are human. Yes. And it is not something that needs to be fixed, right? And so, those stages are. There's just, you can go through them at some, certain ones, but like, I always thought of grief as like something that was inside of me, right? Something that I needed to, kind of work around and figure out and fix so that I could be okay again. But like what I've learned is grief is outside of you. And
it's inside of us.
Yeah.
It's both.
It's both. And it's like, it is this thing that almost has a mind of its own, and it morphs and it changes. But it's like everyone wants you to move on. And I just remember being asked, like, when are you going to move on, Jamie? Like, why do you still talk about your dead son? And I just, every time that was told to me, it was like, well, if I move on, I'm leaving him behind.
And that's not an option.
No, it's not. And so what I've learned more and more through the years is that it's like you're on this journey and you come across, a rock of pain, of loss. And like you put that in your backpack. Mm-hmm. And you carry it with you on this journey, and like, yeah, you get stronger the longer that you carry it, but you never move on from it, and it's not something we're supposed to move on from. It's move past. It's something that we carry with us on this journey.
Right. And that I think is so interesting, because when we look at treating grief, right, we can pathologize it. We can say, I'm going to get a little bit on my high horse again. In the previous DSM, the diagnostic manual, it said that if you grieved longer than 2 weeks, you were eligible for a depression diagnosis, right? Yes.
I'm sorry, 2 weeks?
2 weeks, right?
Yeah,
you get a
'cause
certain
you're
amount of
supposed to
time.
be fine.
You're supposed to be fine, right? And I think we have to think of the culture that we live in as well. There's lots of cultures, oftentimes related to religion, that give us opportunities to grieve or don't, right? Yeah. The Amish community still do funerals in a barn or in a home, and the whole community comes to visit, right? Yeah. They are not a death phobic culture, right? I think in America we have some death phobia. And a lot of that comes from the idea that death was dirty. We had wars, and so we would have all of these bodies, World War I, World War II, right? And we have all these bodies, and death is unclean. But if we can medicalize it, if we can put it in white sheets and sterilize it, we don't have to look at it anymore. And somehow we are past it, or we are immune to it, right? And so I want to ask some kind of advice. I guess we'll do advice on what not to do. What don't you say to someone who's grieving?
There's so many.
There's lots of them.
There's lots
There's
of
so
them.
many of them. But for you personally, what wasn't helpful to hear, and why wasn't it helpful?
So my favorite one, I mean, not favorite.
Right, your least favorite one.
Least favorite, I think, over the years has been everything happens for a reason.
Yeah, let's unpack that.
Okay.
What reason?
Right.
What reason?
Right. And so, I mean, that for me, that what I heard through, my grief lens was that, like, this was done to you, and this is on purpose, So, instead of saying that, what I've learned to reframe in my mind is, okay, this person wants to give me an antidote to fix me right now and make me feel better and silver line this, which we just cannot do. And so instead of that, instead of everything happens for a reason, I'm like, there will be purpose given to this pain someday, and I can cling to that. Yes. And there also is, I have permission to allow joy and sorrow to coexist. Okay.
They're sisters.
Yes. They get to mingle. There's just things that it's okay to laugh about things, to have joy, and to laugh through tears, or all of that, allowing that to coexist and mingle. I think one of the other things that that specifically as a baby loss mom who has been, well, at least you can have the at least thing, right? At least, yeah. At any time it starts with at least, I'm like,
just scratch it off.
I'm like, stop talking.
No, that's enough.
Just not listening. But at least you can have another one, And
what does that say? That says that your son was replaceable. And he was not.
No. And he's a puppy, and I can just go to the,
right.
No. And also, I don't know if I can. Yeah. So that's probably maybe not an option. It happens.
It's not helpful in two directions.
Yeah, totally. Yes. And I think also that, God needed an angel, and I'm like, I don't think he needs anything from us. It's just that whole trying to make it better, right? Which is not what grievers need. As a grief bearer, which is kind of what I coined, I guess, for myself, and love Lord of the Rings, and Frodo and Samwise were carrying this burden, to Mordor, and they were called ring bearers, and there was a moment where Frodo couldn't carry it anymore. He couldn't walk anymore, and so
carried him.
So Samwise says, I can't carry this for you, but I can carry you. And so, it's
one of my favorite scenes of any movies, so I'm so happy that you brought it up. Yes. It's such a beautiful metaphor for being with people that are grieving.
Yes.
And the idea that your grief is not my grief, right? but I can help support you in this way.
Yes.
I can be available, and I can hold space.
Yeah.
The thing I always think about when I'm working with people who have grief or in my own personal experiences is you just kind of have to lean into that discomfort, right? It's going to feel counterintuitive, I think, but the idea of leaning into something that doesn't feel good and we want to avoid and we want to push back on, the only way out is through, right? Yeah. It's something that I think if we can learn as a community, as a state, as a country, to lean in a little bit. And that we don't need fixing, right? I just need you to hear. I need you to listen. I need you to see me. And I need you to see your son. I need you to see my mom. And that is really what it's about. There's no fixing. There is just witnessing. Tell me a little bit about what you think is helpful to someone who's in acute grief. Let's say they just found out they lost someone, or they're in the first few weeks. Do you have any ideas on what people can do? We have this grief, now what? I'm grieving, I'm caring for a grieving child or a grieving spouse or a grieving parent, a neighbor. What are your ideas?
I think, in pulling from my own experience or what we've done, with our nonprofit with moms who lose babies, I think for the first thing is acknowledgement, right? So it almost feels like people are so uncomfortable and afraid of other people's grief that you almost feel like it's like contagious, right?
Don't catch it.
Yeah, right. And so they just almost, like, I remember the people that said nothing, that hurt way more than the people who said the wrong thing.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Because the people saying the wrong thing you can recognize they're attempting.
Yeah.
Right? They're reaching out and they're doing the best that maybe they've got.
Right.
Yes.
And so I think that first thing is to step into that discomfort, to not be afraid of someone else's pain enough to just be with them, right? And calling, texting, not avoiding this thing that you think is contagious or makes you uncomfortable, but even just practical things like people showed up to my house and cleaned my entire house. And I didn't even and here's the thing too, people will say okay, well, let me know if you need anything. And it's I don't know what I need.
Absolutely.
I don't know what I need right now. And so, just showing up, bringing meals, not asking for the griever to let you know if they need anything,
Sure.
because they don't know what they need in that moment. And so I think, talking about their loved ones, saying their name. Yes. I think that was one of my biggest fears, was that I would be the only person saying Edwin.
And how many people say Edwin to this day?
A lot.
A lot of people, right? And that's so healing. That's so, it's a vulnerable space to put yourself in, but it feels so good to know that people are remembering.
Yeah.
And that is so important.
Yeah. And I kind of make them.
You're going to say it and you're going to like it.
I'm one of those people that's I'm going to keep talking about him, whether it makes people uncomfortable or not. Sure. Because I also want other grievers to know that to have that permission almost, or if they want to, that you can grieve on purpose and out loud too.
And you might need to.
Yeah. And if everyone grieves different, and if you need that more, quiet space, cool. But I think so many people feel afraid to grieve out loud or to grieve on purpose. And
you could put grieve out loud on a shirt and it would just, it's a beautiful way of putting it. It's just so succinct.
Yeah. And it's just you can, if you need to do this, if you need to post pictures, if you need, if that helps your process
your
and journey, do it. And who cares who it makes uncomfortable, because this is a stigma we have to break.
Absolutely.
Because people are grieving in silence and feeling alone. And I'm not about to let people do that. So.
And we can talk about sort of that silent grief, right? That idea that we call it disenfranchised grief, when you're not allowed to grieve because of the context that you're in, your situation.
Yeah.
Oftentimes we see this with nurses who are caring for people, and maybe a patient passes and they still have a shift to do, right? But we ourselves can be disenfranchised in some way because maybe our culture, our religion, our family says we don't talk about it. Or it's too painful. And it causes shame when we have those feelings, right? And that is so detrimental to the whole healing process. I want to pull back just a little bit. I want to talk about kind of that acute grief when it first happens. I'm going to get a little medical here, a little bit of biology. Grief is a stress response, right?
Yes.
We get epinephrine and we get all of those hormones flooding at cortisol flowing through our bodies. Our immune system takes a hit. We are more susceptible to cardiac issues, inflammatory disorders and diseases. I mean, it really is truly a stressful situation.
Absolutely.
And biologically, physiologically, it is a stress response. And that acute grief is one of the most, I mean, I think it's like number 2 on the list of like most stressful situations is like the death of a spouse or a parent, right? And so I really want anyone who's listening to remember that if we have grief, it is very likely you're going to get sick, you're going to feel run down. Emotionally, you're not going to feel great. We know that. But physically, you're not going to be running 10Ks probably, right? I mean, we have to really think about taking care of our bodies as we move through grief. We talked about what you wouldn't say. I want to know what you would say to someone who's grieving or someone who is in a moment that they need that support.
I think, honestly, the things that I would say or, do is not try to fill the silence or like that uncomfortable space, right? But like honestly, simply saying like, I love you and I am so sorry. Yeah. And saying their name, right? Or, even just asking, what was your favorite part of, this time with, and then their name, or, can talking about, that person and allowing the griever that space to talk about them as well. I would say, things like, I am here for the long haul, right? Because like you can almost put a date on the calendar of when everybody moves on, right? So everyone else, there's this rush of support and like everyone's coming in and everyone's talking about it and there's posts all over social media. And then everyone else kind of moves on with their lives and you're like still in shock. Right. And so, I think it's really important, and I've learned to kind of be a long hauler with people of like, hey, in a couple months, like I'm still going to be checking on you and I'm still going to be like coming over and like watching your kids or, folding your laundry,
right.
Like I'm still going to talk about your child or your spouse or your parent or your friend. Like I'm not afraid of your grief and I'm not afraid of your pain. And I want to just kind of sit here with you. And so I think just allowing the griever, that space to talk about it if they want to not talk about it if they don't, but to just be there. What would you say?
I think, I was going to go with something you already said, so you stole my answer.
Sorry.
I feel like what's really important for people is, again, to share their person. And so for me, it's tell me a story. And I think we also struggle as a culture we sort of put our beloved dead on a pedestal. They never did any wrong. We can't speak ill of them. They can have never made us angry or sad or anything because now they're gone. And so I can only talk about good things. And so for me, I think it's important to talk about some of the struggles I had with my mom, or to have my clients or the people I'm working with talk about the good and the bad, the silly and the disgusting, and the beautiful and the not so beautiful, right? I mean, I think we do a disservice to, I call them our beloved dead, right? Our beloved dead that we have, to just look at them as they're one single facet, right? And so for me, it's always tell me a story, or what was this like? And watching people be able to, and this is to your point, we can cry and we can still move, right? Yeah. They're crying and they're telling me a story. Or they're crying and they're laughing, or they're crying and they're healing. And I mean, we can cry and do anything, right? I can cry and do yard work.
Yeah.
You know, and sometimes in grief you do that, right?
Yeah.
You cry and you do all this stuff. And so for me, that's what I think is really important, is that remembrance piece. And that brings me to the topic of kind of rituals. So we know that we have in our culture, we do funerals or memorial services, and we have certain things that we do. I mean, Jewish culture, for example, Orthodox, they do sitting Shiva. They give time to be away between the death and the funeral, for you don't have responsibilities, just take care of this process, right? But as an American culture, I want us to think about the fact that we don't have a ton of rituals, right? We have kind of the funeral or the memorial service, and then we dust our hands off, right?
Like 3 days.
Yeah, right. God, wouldn't it be nice if we were done with it in 3 days?
Yeah.
But we're not.
Nope.
So what are rituals that you feel like people can do? Or what are moments that you think we could put in rituals to help people remember and grieve?
You know, I think one of the things that, like, my family's always done every year, whether it's, you know, on his birthday and due dates, that kind of thing, is like we do balloon release, right? And, you know, or write letters and send them off on balloons. You know, I think one thing too for like baby loss awareness, or infant and pregnancy awareness loss, there's like a day where we all, it's called a wave of light, and we all light a candle at the same time, and having things. I mean, like, I have a tattoo on my foot of my son's name and his teeny footprints. He's always walking with me, you know, things like that, like getting remembrance tattoos, or, you know, having that special thing that is like theirs, you know. So for Edwin, it's butterflies, you know, and just, I just think it's really important to, you know, and I've had people for his 5th birthday, I think I had 40 people show up. Yeah, and we had a cake and a balloon release. We did LED light, like the LED balloons at night, and it was amazing. And I just remember looking around thinking, like, there are 40 people here for a birthday party of a little boy they've never met. And just like that level of support and like just acknowledgement was like such an honor. And so I just think, like, not being afraid to say their name, or, you know, to have the special, I mean, people have sent me, you know, butterfly earrings, or, you know, like things that are just like, I know this is his thing, and like this made me think of you, and just like that importance is just incredible. Like honoring, right? And so there's ways that you can honor your loved one, and then also like acknowledging and honoring other people's, right?
I always say that if you have never experienced a loss, it's because you were the first to go. I mean, it's such a universal experience.
Yes.
We lose people. I mean, it happens. It's a fact of life. It's something that we can wrestle with all the time. But being able to be with people as they go through the things that we went through.
Such an honor.
It feels horrible.
Yeah.
And we get to do
awful.
it. And it's beautiful and it's awful.
Yes.
Another piece of, as we sort of talk about this, some advice I wanted to think about is the idea that we pour in, dump out, right? Are you familiar with the concept?
Yeah, a little bit, but school me.
So the idea, I'm going to give an example. Your neighbor passes, you are very close to your neighbor. Yeah. You're probably not going to go to your neighbor's spouse and talk about how difficult it is for you, because the spouse was almost definitely much closer to the neighbor, slightly. Probably, right? There's always exceptions to a rule. But the idea being that when we are grieving someone, we don't want to dump on the people closest to that griever, right? Or to the person that passed.
Yes.
We want to dump on the people who are further away, right? In the example of a neighbor, you might go to your spouse, you know, who was not close to the neighbor, and say, I'm really struggling here. Can you walk me through this? Versus going to their spouse and talking about, this is so hard for me. No one will understand. And I'm sure that you've gotten those comments of how hard this is for.
Yeah. Or I know how you feel. My dog died. And I'm like, okay. Yeah.
It's different, right?
Yeah. Not the Trauma Olympics, but
right.
yeah, you know. But like, Okay. Yeah. So, yeah.
So as we think about supporting people in grief, we can think about pour in support towards the center being the person who passed, right? That's spouses or partners, that is children, that is parents. And then as we kind of go outward, we can dump out, just to provide that sort of community support, that wraparound. Because I think that oftentimes we don't think about that, right? We think about everyone's hurting and I'm hurting and who do I talk to? We don't always know who to talk to or who to go with, right? And I think it's so important to recognize that we do have someone, but it can't be the person closest, right? They need the most support.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you feel like I'm trying to think of the word to say here. How do you feel like you sit with your feelings when they've come up? Because it's been years, and yet you still have grief symptoms.
Oh, yeah.
So how do we sit with that? How do we say to ourselves, well, it's been X amount of years, I should be over it? Because we do say those things to ourselves,
Or people say them to you.
Or people say them to you, right?
Yeah.
In our media, in our movies and TV shows, we see someone die and we get one scene where someone's crying one single tear, and then they get a speech about how life goes on and they heroically show up and everything's better and fine, right? So I think there's a lot of shame about grief.
Yeah.
So being someone who has had grief for a long time, how do we sit with those feelings when we know they're going to crop up and when they do?
Whew, yeah, that's a heavy one.
It's a heavy question.
It is interesting to look back on 10 years, a decade of grief, and it's like that's where like my grief journey started was losing Edwin. After that I lost my marriage. Shortly after that I lost one of my best friends, Matt, in a car accident. After that, I lost, a guy I was dating to COVID, and I was there with him in the room, and when he passed away. And so it's just like there has been kind of like grief upon grief upon grief. And so it's like and everyone has been different, right? There's different elements. I feel like there's different rooms of your heart that get opened. And I think what I've learned how to sit in the discomfort or sit in those feelings has been to not, because in the past too, I've tried to run and numb and do everything I could to escape these feelings, because it was like, this is too much. This pain is way too much. I can't.
It's going to overwhelm me completely.
Yes, honestly felt there were times where I'm like, this is going to kill me. I am going to die.
I can't get past this. There's no way.
Right. And so I think one of the biggest tools that I've been able to, pull out is breathing. Honestly, 4-7-8, thanks mom, is really sitting and breathing. And music has been a huge I guess tool and a way that I've been able to process through things where it's like I have no words right now, but this song that this person wrote is the words, or I write music too, processing through that, talking to somebody who gets it. My good friend Shayla, who started this nonprofit I'll Love You Forever when she lost her twins, I would call her, still do, at 3 a.m, I can't do this.
I'm going through it again.
I'm I'm in it. And she's like, I'm in it with you, having those safe people that have, given you space to be where you're at, and honestly, having a really good therapist and doing trauma therapy. And I think it's just, there's so many facets, but I think the biggest one is just knowing that every baby shower announcement, or every pregnancy announcement, or I do a lot of maternity photos or newborn photos, and they've gotten easier to do, but there is still always this little sting, right, that this might not ever happen for me someday, and that's okay. But I volunteer with foster kids, with teenagers in the foster care system with Hope and a Future. And that those kids have been like probably the most healing. They like hurt and heal my heart in the same moment, because they're like, I call them shadow kids. So kind of like they're, at that age where it's like, oh my gosh, Edwin would be this age, and I'm watching what 10, 11, 12-year-old little boys are into, or like,
Right.
How they act, which is, kind of off the wall sometimes, but like these kiddos are in foster care, and as much as like my mother heart feels like it's got all this love with nowhere to go, like their heart for a mother's love is like bigger. And so like pouring into these kids has been one of the most healing things for me. And so I think, that has been one of the probably the most healing things, is pouring into others who are hurting. And these moms that lose babies that we get to make boxes for. I think it's just, giving purpose to your pain and turning tragedy to joy, because like joy really grows out of the soil of suffering, right? And so just like looking for opportunities of how I can be a vessel of hope and a vessel of joy in the midst of and because of tragedy and loss. So
I want to talk a little bit about something you said, and that was that connection is the healing piece of that, right?
Yep.
Grief comes from, or there is a framework through attachment theory. So that's John Bowlby. He had his whole child attachment. This is how parents and children attach, right?
Yeah.
And it's because of that attachment system that we have that we grieve. If we were not attached to anyone in our lives, we would not grieve them. And so it really is, again, physiologically and biologically and psychologically mixed, that we would have attachment and grief together.
Yeah.
And that the only way to heal, I won't even say all of it, but most of it, right, is through connection. And that connection piece is the most important piece, I think, when we think about that healing process. Let's talk a little bit, just as we kind of wrap this up, about parents with children who are grieving. What might you say to a parent? Or do you have some, because I have some ideas, but I'm wondering, you are spending so much time supporting these mothers. How might you help them with their children who might also be grieving or who have lost a sibling? What might you say, or what might you do?
I mean, and through with I Love You Forever, we do a lot of these moms who lose babies have kids. They have, 6, 7, 10-year-old kids who are like, what? And like they've lost a sibling, or, or kids who've lost grandparents. I think honestly, like any like nugget I could give would just be to allow that kid to have space to talk about their feelings, and if they want to cry, if they want to be angry, if they want to throw a pillow, or whatever, like just giving them that space to grieve how they need to.
But Jamie, they're kids. They're not supposed to know death. They're not supposed to grieve. What do we say to that?
I say that that's not true.
But we have that idea, right? If someone passes, they go to the neighbors, they go to grandma's or something. We don't include our children in the grieving process, right?
Right.
And I think it's so important to recognize that our children will have grief feelings too.
Yes, and it's gonna like shielding them from that. It's gonna affect them down the road, And I mean, some people have thought it's crazy, but we've had moms where they've had a stillborn baby, and the siblings come meet their little brother
Their
or sister.
sibling, yeah.
And what that does is it normalizes, right, this thing, and it destigmatizes, but it also allows these kids to have a grasp on the reality of death. Like when it's like, as adults, I feel like this might be a huge reason why we don't know what to do with it, is because like it was
no one taught us.
No, and it was like we weren't exposed to it. And like we've, even with, back in the day, 30 years ago, if a mom had a stillborn baby, they took the baby and the mom never had to hold that baby.
Never saw the baby.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
And it's like, that doesn't make it any better.
Now you're just having an ambiguous loss of like, I never even saw this person that died. I never saw them.
Right. And so I think, for kids, I think it's so, I mean, when my grandma died when I was 10, people told my mom she was crazy, but like my mom had us, me and my sister, come in that room, with hospice, and we got to say goodbye, and we got to have that tangible experience with the reality of death. And like I fully believe that experience carried through into my adulthood to where I'm like a advocate for, if like let's get real and like let's talk about this, because just shoving it down and trying to numb it's not doing it. You can't start healing from anything when you do that. And so I just think, as much as you can, just allowing your kiddos to feel their big feelings, and not tell them they shouldn't feel a certain way, because it makes you uncomfortable. But
if it doesn't work with adults, it's probably not going to work with children. We have to be able to feel those feelings.
Yes, and just giving them space too. Yes.
We know developmentally that some children have a different view of death than others, right? With littles, I always say 5 to 7, we have to get really concrete about what death is, because they know that death is less alive, but don't quite understand, is it permanent, and so I think we have to look at things developmentally. Yeah. And it's okay to give kids that idea that it's a concrete thing, right? That we're going to have a chance to say goodbye. We're going to be able to talk about it after and during and before, right? I think the best time, in my experience, to prep a child for a loss is before the loss happens. We can use media, we can use books and TV shows and movies that when a death happens and a child has a question, we can answer those questions honestly, right? We don't have to say, oh, it's just a movie, and then they never really know. Right. And I think using those opportunities to be a supportive family, to have that whole family system come together and grieve together is so important, because oftentimes, as we know, we feel so isolated. Oh, yeah. And that connection is kind of the most healing part of the whole thing. Absolutely. Is there anything else you would like to add as we kind of wrap up this episode? Any extra advice, anything you want to share?
I mean, I think, just to kind of wrap it up on my end is that I fully believe, and I've seen evidence of, and I feel like I am on this quest to share about my own story, and like even the icky chapters that make people uncomfortable, because my heart's cry is that anyone who is hurting knows that they're not alone. Yeah. And so like for me, that I will do that till the day I die. Like I will continue to talk about the things that make others uncomfortable, because I want to see change in this world. And I want people who are suffering, who are hurting, to know that there's hope, and that they're not alone, and that they belong. Yeah. So I love
that. Yeah. I think just to wrap up, from my end, I just want to kind of summarize what we've all talked about, and that is that grief is normal. Grief is universal. If you've never experienced it, because you were the first one gone, right? Yeah. Everyone's going to have it. It makes it so different than depression or anxiety, or because not everyone has those experiences of like clinical depression, but everyone's going to experience a loss, right? Yeah. So it's normal, it's universal. It's not going to look the same for everyone. Yep. And I think it's okay to take the time to isolate a little bit and like find your feelings and sit there. And it's okay to go out and to be with people. It's okay to laugh. It's okay to cry. It's okay to scream. You might do all of those in one day and you're still normal. You're still okay. And I want to just emphasize again that we can integrate grief. We can walk with grief. We can integrate it so it's not something that is debilitating every moment of our lives. And we don't set it down. It's still with us. And that's how we do it, how we live, right? Yeah. And so I think that's what I want people to leave with today, is that we will walk with it, and it might feel a little lighter, but that's not because it's lighter, it's because we get a little stronger.
That's right.
So,
Yep.
yeah.
And grief does not make us broken. It makes us human.
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
yeah.
Right. It was beautiful talking to you.
You too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been Roadmap to Joy. If you enjoyed this episode, you can like or subscribe, and thanks for listening and watching.